Ask an American who the best special forces on Earth are, and half of them won't say the SEALs. They'll say the SAS. The stranger part, the part that makes this more than a bar argument, is that some of the people saying it are hardened American operators with direct experience in both communities. There's a story that circulates in military circles. It's worth knowing up front that it's barracks legend, not documented history. In the version most people tell, a US Army Delta Force unit and a British SAS team are sharing the same forward operating base. Delta puts up a sign outside their area, second to none. The SAS read it and hang their own sign directly above it. One word: none. Whether that happened in exactly that way, at that specific base, on any particular date, nobody can confirm. No photograph exists. The camp is never named. But the fact that this story keeps getting told, keeps getting passed around, and is recognizable across different units in different eras, says something real. Not about what happened on that gate, about how the two communities see each other. Former US Navy SEAL Taylor Cavanaugh, who also served with the French Foreign Legion, put it plainly in a recorded interview. He was asked to name the best Special Forces units on Earth. Overall armed forces, he said, probably the United States. But unit for unit? He pointed to Britain. The SAS and the SBS, he said, are probably at the top, or near the top, globally. He's one of the few named, on record, former American operators to say it that directly. He's not alone in thinking it. The sentiment shows up in forums, in veteran interviews, in the communities where people who've worked alongside British Special Forces compare notes. SOFREP, the outlet run by former Special Operations figures, documents the Delta Force SAS partnership with consistent framing. The relationship is built on mutual respect between communities who've worked the same hard problems at the same level for decades. There's a reason the SAS's counter-terrorism model directly influenced how American Special Forces train for hostage rescue. When you're building a program from scratch, you go find the people who have been doing it longest and best. American Special Operations went to Hereford. That's professional admiration from people with every professional reason to be partial to their own. The debate itself is genuinely endless. It tends to collapse into funding arguments, selection comparisons, and disputes about which unit is operating in harder terrain on any given Tuesday. None of those arguments settle anything. But every so often, something cuts through all of it. Not a training pipeline breakdown or a kit comparison, but a single event that becomes the reference point everyone keeps reaching for when the conversation restarts. The reference point is January 15th, 2019, the Dusit D2 complex in Nairobi, Kenya, and one British SAS operator who was supposed to be training Kenyan forces that week, not walking into a 19-hour terrorist siege alone. That is the receipt. The debate didn't end on paper. It ended on a Tuesday afternoon in East Africa. 14:30 East Africa time. The Westlands district of Nairobi on a Tuesday afternoon is office lunch hour traffic. People moving between towers, the kind of midday lull where the sounds of the city are mostly engines and conversation. A Toyota Ractis pulls into the driveway of 14 Riverside Drive, an upscale mixed-use complex that houses the Dusit D2 five-star hotel, alongside corporate tenants including LG Electronics, SAP East Africa and I&M Bank. The complex has a restaurant called The Secret Garden. It has a Hanover office block. It has a car park and a series of interconnected buildings occupied by hundreds of people who came to work that morning and had no particular reason to think it was different from any other Tuesday. 4 men step out of the car, A fifth has already made his way to the complex separately. His name was Mahir Khalid Riziki. Born in Mombasa in February 1993, radicalized at a mosque in Majengo, trained with al-Shabaab in Somalia. He had re-entered Kenya just 2 days earlier, on January 13th, crossing at El Wak in Mandera County and taking a bus to Nairobi to link up with the cell leader, Ali Salim Gichunge. He had a specific assignment. He stood near the entrance of the Secret Garden restaurant for approximately 1 minute, long enough for a surveillance camera to record his face, and then detonated his explosive vest. 7 people died around him in the initial blast. The force of the explosion blew through the restaurant's glass and steel, sending fragments through the open courtyard. Simultaneously, the 4 gunmen at the entrance threw 2 grenades at vehicles near the gate, setting them alight. The vehicles caught fast. Then the attackers split into pairs, one pair moving toward the Hanover office block, the other following the smoke toward the secret garden and then into the hotel itself. They were carrying Type 56-2 assault rifles, AK-47 variants manufactured in China. Weapons al-Shabaab had almost certainly seized from Somalia's National Army in raids on Somali National Army stockpiles acquired from Ethiopia in 2013. Inside the complex, the attack sounded different from the outside. First, the concussive thud of the suicide bomb, felt more than heard at distance. A pressure shift that people in the upper office floors registered as something wrong before their minds could name it. Then the distinctive crack of rifle fire, not a car backfiring, not construction, the unmistakable sound that people who've heard it before identify immediately, and those who haven't take several seconds to process. And then, both at once, grenades and rifles, and the first screams moving through the corridors. Al-Shabaab claimed responsibility within hours, releasing a 2-page statement in Arabic and English titled "Jerusalem Will Never Be Judaized," framing the attack as retaliation for the United States recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital, naming its external operations branch, the Saleh and Naban Battalion, as responsible. The group had hit Nairobi before, the Westgate Mall in September 2013, Garissa University College in April 2015. This was their return to the capital after 4 years. People in the office towers made their decisions in seconds. Some froze at desks, some moved to windows to look. Some, the ones who processed it fastest, or who had drilled for exactly this, moved toward interior rooms, bathrooms, storage closets, anywhere without glass. A man climbed into a commercial refrigerator and pulled the door closed behind him. Others barricaded office doors, pushed furniture against them, turned off lights, and sat in the dark, listening to the sounds move through the building. Several pulled out their phones, not to call for help, but to say goodbye. Ronald Njeno found a signal and sent farewell messages to his family, convinced he was writing his last words. An American woman named Maylee Chapin barricaded herself in a room, looked out at the courtyard below, and saw what the attack had left there. She kept looking away. She kept looking back. By mid-afternoon, hundreds of people were hiding in a complex that 4 gunmen were now moving through methodically, looking for anyone they'd missed. Christian Craighead joined the British Army on September 7, 1992. He was 16 years old, from Newcastle upon Tyne. He grew up in a council house in the northeast of England, raised largely by his grandmother during a period of significant economic decline, The collapse of shipbuilding and coal mining had hollowed out communities across the region through the 1980s, leaving unemployment and the particular texture of a place that used to make things. By his own account, joining the army cadets at around 13 kept him away from the more available alternatives: crime, drugs, the drift that took people he knew in other directions. The cadets gave him fieldcraft, marksmanship, discipline, and a target. He credits his grandmother with shaping who he became. By the time he was old enough to enlist for real, the decision wasn't a question. His first posting was the Parachute Regiment, where he served as standard infantry. His years in the Paras gave him the foundation. Then he was selected for something considerably more demanding. The Pathfinder Platoon is the reconnaissance unit of 16 Air Assault Brigade. Not formally classified as special forces, but operating at comparable standards in similar environments for the same reasons. Their mission is to get ahead of the main force, inserted by halo or HAHO parachute drop, by helicopter or by vehicle. Locate and mark parachute drop zones and helicopter landing sites. Conduct close target reconnaissance deep in hostile territory, and gather tactical intelligence that the brigade needs before it commits. They operate in 4 to 6 man patrols. They carry their own supplies, create their own shelter, and maintain their own security for weeks at a time, without expectation of rapid extraction. Calling for backup isn't part of the operational model when you're the people sent out ahead of everyone else. Craighead spent nearly 9 years in the Pathfinders. In February 2003, 16 Air Assault Brigade deployed approximately 5,500 soldiers to Iraq as part of the invasion. Craighead went as a Pathfinder patrol commander. The mission, he later described in interviews, distills the entire Pathfinder experience into one image. 6 men in cut-down Land Rovers, deep in Iraqi territory, conducting close target reconnaissance of a 4,000-man armoured division. Their task wasn't to engage, it was to watch, to observe a formation several hundred times the size of their own team, gather intelligence on it, and feed that information back to brigade headquarters without being seen. 6 men, 4,000 opponents, no margin for error. The mission succeeded. It was the kind of work that does not appear in official summaries and teaches lessons that can't be learned in any training environment. He passed SAS selection in his early 30s. In interviews, he placed his entry into the regiment at approximately age 30, which, given his September 1992 enlistment at 16, puts selection at around 2006, roughly 14 years after he first enlisted as a teenager. The sequence is what matters. Parachute Regiment in his teens, Pathfinders through his 20s, 22 SAS from his early 30s onward. The selection process that earned him the right to wear the beige beret takes approximately 6 months and is specifically designed to eliminate most of the people who attempt it. The attrition comes in stages. The first phase, called the Hills Stage, takes place in the Brecon Beacons and Black Hills of South Wales. Candidates carry burgans that get heavier with each passing week, navigating between checkpoints in timed exercises across mountain terrain, in whatever weather Wales produces in that season. The directing staff, fully badged SAS soldiers, stand at the checkpoints and say nothing. No encouragement, no criticism. No indication of how a candidate is performing relative to the standard. The point of that silence is exact. The SAS needs operators who don't require external reinforcement to function. If a man can only sustain effort when someone is telling him he's doing well, he's not what the regiment is looking for. The culminating test of the hills phase is the long drag, a 40-mile trek over the Black Mountains, carrying a 55-pound pack completed in under 24 hours. After that, jungle training, typically in Belize, living and patrolling in 4-man teams deep in dense terrain for weeks. The jungle is physically and psychologically different from anything most soldiers have experienced. The heat and humidity don't relent. The visibility is often measured in feet. Maintaining kit, maintaining discipline, maintaining the basic operational competency required to function as part of a team. All of it under sustained discomfort, with no clean end date visible. Then escape and evasion. Candidates are released into open countryside with minimal equipment and told to reach a series of waypoints while a hunter force of other soldiers actively works to capture them. 3 days of that. Then tactical questioning. Interrogation conducted under severe physical stress and sleep deprivation. The candidate required to resist by answering every question with 4 things only: name, rank, serial number, date of birth. The questioning is designed to be disorienting. The stress positions, the white noise, the passage of time becoming untrackable. The point isn't cruelty for its own sake, but a specific test of whether a man's mental architecture holds together when the external world is actively working to tear it apart. Approximately 90% of those who start the process never finish it. Those who do earn a place in one of 22 SAS Sabre squadrons, where the defining tactical unit is the 4-man patrol. The doctrine behind that formation is specific and deliberate. 1 to lead, 1 to cover, 1 to watch flanks, and if a casualty occurs, 2 to carry the wounded man, while a 3rd maintains security. It's the minimum viable team structure for operating in a hostile environment without becoming a liability to your own people. 4 men can sustain the mission when 1 goes down. 3 can't reliably carry a casualty and maintain security simultaneously. 2 is tactically indefensible. The 4-man patrol isn't a tradition. It's an engineering solution to the problem of how small numbers of highly skilled operators can keep functioning when things go wrong. Craighead spent approximately 15 years in 22 SAS, rising to Warrant Officer Class 2. His publisher's biographical note states he participated in more than 1,000 high-risk missions across Iraq, Afghanistan, and other theatres. He retired on September 7, 2020, 28 years to the day after he enlisted as a 16-year-old in Newcastle, standing outside a recruitment office in the northeast of England with a grandmother's values and an army cadet's sense of direction. In January 2019, he was in Nairobi, attached to a training program for Kenyan Special Forces through the British Embassy. He was supposed to be an advisor that week. He learned about the attack from a friend's phone call. The call came in the afternoon. By that point, the Dusit D2 complex had been under attack for some time. The information was basic. There's an attack at 14 Riverside Drive, armed gunmen, ongoing. That was enough. There was no activation order, no formal authorization, no briefing package delivered through a chain of command. He was off-duty, unattached to any operational structure that afternoon. He geared up anyway. The kit he chose was deliberate. Body armour strapped on over civilian clothes. He was still wearing jeans. A balaclava pulled over his face. An L119A1 carbine, the short-barreled assault rifle that is standard issue for British Special Forces, chambered in 5.56mm, compact enough for close-quarters work in tight corridors and stairwells. A sidearm. He wore a shield badge on his tactical vest, the kind of identification that would tell Kenyan security forces approaching him that he wasn't a threat. He drove toward 14 Riverside Drive through Nairobi's afternoon traffic. The city does not clear easily. Traffic in Westlands on a Tuesday afternoon is dense and slow, and the smoke rising from the burning cars near the complex's entrance would have been visible well before he arrived. He drove toward it anyway. What he found when he arrived was this: private security guards, armed civilians, and off-duty police officers had already gathered at the perimeter. There were Kenyan security forces assembling. There was smoke coming from inside the compound. There was the sound, still, of weapons. And there was no organized team actively moving into the building to engage the gunmen. The threat was inside. The structure required to address it was still forming outside. He looked at the situation. He went in. He moved through the entrance to the complex with his carbine up and his call sign ready, Eagle Eagle Security Forces, calling it out as he moved through corridors so that anyone hiding in a room, listening to approaching footsteps, could make the critical distinction between an attacker moving toward them and someone coming to get them out. In a building full of people hiding in the dark, that distinction took seconds to make and cost lives when people got it wrong. The call sign was a technical, professional detail. So was the body armor. So was the route he chose through the building. Not random movement, but methodical clearing, floor by floor. The same process he had run hundreds of times in a training facility in Hereford called the Killing House, and hundreds more times in operational environments across Iraq and Afghanistan. He was carrying wounded people out with his arms, going back in while gunmen were still active. The CCTV footage that the world saw within hours captures something that takes a moment to fully register. A lone masked figure moving with deliberate, unhurried precision through a building that was still, at that moment, a kill zone. Not running, not panicked. Moving the way someone moves when they have done this so many times that the fear has been converted into process. He engaged the gunmen directly. He shot and killed at least 2 of the attackers. The Kenyan Recce Company and General Service Unit were active throughout the operation. This was a multi-agency response over 19 hours, not a single operator action from start to finish. At some point during the engagement, he was joined by Dan Prostalo, a Slovenian member of the Diplomatic Protective Services Tactical Response Unit. Together, they continued clearing areas and pressing against the remaining attackers. But in the critical early window, in the period before organized units had assembled and were methodically clearing the building in numbers, one operator was already inside doing the work. The siege lasted approximately 19 hours in total. Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta addressed the nation on the morning of January 16, 2019, confirming that all 5 militants had been eliminated and that approximately 700 people had been rescued from the complex over the course of the operation. The final casualty count stood at 21 civilians killed during the attack itself. 19 Kenyan nationals, 1 British citizen, and 1 American. The nurse, Noel Kidaliza, critically injured during the attack, died of her wounds nearly a year later, on January 3, 2020, bringing the toll to 22. 28 people were wounded and hospitalized. All 5 attackers were killed. The numbers are real. And they're terrible. But numbers alone don't carry what it meant to be inside that building. Enoch Kibet worked as a cafe cleaner at the complex. He heard the initial blast, that first concussive thud that he would later describe as arriving before he understood what it was. Saw people around him beginning to scream and run. Found his way instinctively toward a basement gate and pulled himself through it. He told reporters afterward that he couldn't believe he was still alive. It wasn't a figure of speech. He genuinely hadn't expected to be. Ronald Ngeno barricaded himself somewhere in the building with no certainty about whether anyone was coming. He found a phone signal. He used it not to call emergency services, who already knew, but to send goodbye messages to his family, because he couldn't see how this ended with him walking out. The specific quality of that decision, choosing to spend his remaining minutes making sure the people he loved heard from him, is what survivor accounts from these events tend to circle around. Not heroism, just people trying to do the last decent thing they can think of with the time they have left. Another survivor, captured on video by the Associated Press, described finding a commercial refrigerator and climbing inside it. The cold, the darkness, the way sound travels differently inside a metal box. Gunfire and grenades filtered through steel walls, while he held himself still and tried to make no sound. He gave his name. He told the camera afterward that he hadn't known what else to do. The American survivor, Maylee Chapin, spent 19 hours in the complex. She barricaded a room. She looked out at the courtyard below and saw what the opening blast had left there, and made herself stop looking, and then found herself looking again. Her later account of those hours describes time moving strangely, the way extreme fear compresses some moments and stretches others until the sequence stops making sense. She credited the SAS operator with her survival, not in a vague general way, but specifically. When the armed figure arrived and began engaging the attackers, the dynamic inside the building changed. That shift is the operational truth underneath the statistics. 4 armed men who had spent the previous hours hunting unarmed civilians in a building they had pre-scouted were now being actively hunted themselves by someone categorically more capable than they were at this exact set of tasks. They had to stop hunting and start defending. They had to redirect attention, to consolidate, to think about where the threat was coming from, to deal with a man who was engaging them rather than hiding from them. The corridors they'd been sweeping became corridors where someone was sweeping back. In those windows, in the minutes and hours when a gunman was occupied with a real threat rather than searching a stairwell for civilians, people moved. They reached exits. They found the gaps that the pressure Craighead created opened up between their hiding places and the doors. Some crawled, some ran, some were carried. That is where the 700 comes from. Not from one dramatic rescue at one particular moment, but from a sustained pressure that redirected 4 attackers' attention and kept redirecting it for hours, while hundreds of people found routes out of a building they'd thought they were trapped inside. Here is where the doctrine argument becomes the actual argument. The SAS trains to work in units, 4-man patrols, the minimum viable team for operating in hostile territory without becoming a liability. Every operator in the regiment has this architecture internalized through selection and through years of operational experience. Going alone is genuinely more dangerous, not as a philosophical statement, but as a tactical fact. You have no one to watch your flank, no one to cover your movement, no one to carry you out if you're hit. The doctrine exists because the alternative, over decades of operations, has produced body bags. Craighead went alone. The UK Foreign Office and Ministry of Defence later described his actions by multiple accounts as those of a mutineer. A poor example for junior soldiers who might take from it the lesson that ignoring command structures and acting unilaterally was acceptable behaviour. He hadn't waited for orders. He hadn't coordinated with a formal command structure or requested authorization from anyone above him. He'd driven himself to an active terrorist attack on the basis of a phone call from a friend and his own professional assessment of what the situation required. That's a legitimate institutional concern. In a hierarchical organization built around command authority and unit cohesion, the last thing senior leadership wants is operators deciding independently to walk into active firefights because they personally judged it necessary. That logic, applied broadly, produces chaos. The institution isn't wrong to have the concern. It's also almost entirely beside the point of what happened. The SAS selection process, 6 months, 90% failure rate, the Brecon Beacons and the jungle and the interrogation suite, does not select for compliance. It does not filter for people who follow orders well under comfortable circumstances. Every phase of selection is specifically engineered to find people who have internalized the mission deeply enough to execute it when the structure around them disappears. The directing staff's silence at the hills checkpoints. The weeks in the jungle without a lifeline. The escape and evasion exercise where the candidate is alone in open country with a hunter force on their trail. Every one of those phases is testing the same thing. Can this person sustain judgment and effective action without external reinforcement? The answer Craighead's 28-year career had given to that question, definitively, repeatedly, across more than 1,000 missions, was yes. His decision to enter the Dusit D2 complex alone wasn't a failure of that training. It was the training functioning exactly as the regiment designed it. He assessed the situation with the tools he had. No active response team inside the building, civilians actively dying. A window to act before the attackers had adapted to armed resistance. And a skill differential between himself and the 4 gunmen that his own experience told him was substantial. He made the decision that 28 years of the hardest military training Britain produces told him was the right one. In interviews after Nairobi, Craighead reportedly described going into the building as feeling like a heavyweight boxing champion entering the ring against amateurs. The framing is important. That's not bravado for its own sake. That's the honest professional assessment of someone who has cleared buildings under fire hundreds of times, who ran close target reconnaissance with 6 men against a 4,000-strong armoured division, who spent years in environments where the phrase, "this isn't the right time," simply wasn't available. A warrant officer Class 2 in 22 SAS does not perceive his own capabilities the way a civilian does. He perceives them the way a surgeon perceives the difference between himself and someone who has watched surgical videos on YouTube. The skill differential is real. He knew what it was. David Stirling chose the regiment's motto in the North African desert in 1941, at the SAS's founding. He had listened to alternatives. Strike and destroy was one of them, and rejected them in favour of 3 words that captured the actual theory of the unit he was building. Not the largest forces, not the most equipment. The combination of genuine individual capability and willingness to act decisively against odds that conventional military thinking would consider unfavourable. Who Dares Wins isn't an invitation to recklessness. It's a description of what high individual competence produces when it meets a decision at the right moment. The distinction matters. Daring without capability is just dying badly. What Stirling was describing, and what his selection process was designed to produce, was the specific kind of daring that is underwritten by extraordinary competence. The kind where the calculation looks insane from the outside and rational from the inside, because the person making it has an accurate read on their own capability and the opposition's. On January 15th, 2019, that motto was enacted rather than quoted. On November 14, 2019, Christian Craighead was officially awarded the Conspicuous Gallantry Cross. The CGC is Britain's second highest military decoration for gallantry in the face of the enemy. Created in 1993, sitting one level below the Victoria Cross. The official record entry is characteristically compressed. Craighead, Christian MBE, Warrant Officer Class 2, Special Air Service, Parachute Regiment, United Kingdom, November 14, 2019, Kenya. One line. 28 years and a 19-hour siege rendered into a database entry. He was supposed to receive the medal from Queen Elizabeth II. The investiture was planned for 2020. COVID cancelled the ceremony. In 2021, Christian Craighead received Britain's second highest gallantry decoration from a civil servant in an office near St James's Park. He described this himself, without apparent bitterness, but with a precision that made the contrast impossible to miss. The tailors who prepared his formal dress uniform reportedly had to reinforce the fabric to support the weight of his medals. Britain wasn't finished with him. In October 2023, the UK High Court ruled that Craighead, identified in legal documents only as a pseudonym for a former SAS Warrant Officer Class 2, couldn't publish a memoir about the Nairobi operation. Mrs. Justice Steyn held that the lifelong confidentiality agreement he had signed on joining the regiment superseded his Article 10 rights under the European Convention on Human Rights. The planned memoir was titled One Man In. The Ministry of Defence's position was that the confidentiality agreement controlled what he could say forever, including about an event that had been broadcast live on television, captured on CCTV, and watched by millions of people around the world. He had sought judicial review. The court sided with the MOD. He couldn't tell his own story in his own country. The contrast with Kenya was substantial. Within hours of the attack, CCTV images of a masked, heavily armed foreign operator leading civilians through the Dusit D2 complex had circulated globally. Kenyan media identified him before British media did. The government of Kenya publicly credited its security forces and international partners with rescuing around 700 people. On social media platforms, on Kenyan news channels, in the coverage from international wire services, the masked figure in the balaclava and jeans became immediately recognizable as someone who had walked into the worst thing happening in Nairobi that day, and walked toward it rather than away. The nickname Obi-Wan Nairobi emerged in military social media circles and spread outward until it appeared in mainstream coverage. The playable operator Otter in Call of Duty Modern Warfare, released later in 2019, was described in multiple sources as based on his image as a British SAS operator in that footage. The 700 people who left that complex alive were grateful in a way that didn't require institutional approval. The people who'd sent goodbye messages to their families from barricaded rooms, the man who'd hidden in the refrigerator, the cafe cleaner who'd crawled through a basement gate. They knew what they owed and said so. Britain's response was to try the legal route, to present the man as a mutineer, to deliver his gallantry medal through a civil servant, to block the book. Craighead published a children's book called The Wrong Wolf, while the memoir remained legally blocked in the UK. He now lives in Texas. In 2026, he announced plans to publish One Man In the United States instead, in direct defiance of the MOD's position. The institution that trained him for 28 years and then tried to silence him found that the country which had benefited most immediately from his training took the opposite view. Back to the debate. The SEALs concede the SAS are the best framing deserves one honest accounting before we close. There is no official statement, no institutional declaration, no formal summit at which the American Special Operations community rendered a collective verdict about their British counterparts. What exists is a documented pattern. Former operators on the record naming British units at or near the top. Joint training programs at Hereford, where Delta and SAS have worked together for decades. A cultural cross-pollination deep enough that the SAS's counter-terrorism model directly shaped how American forces train for the same mission sets. Taylor Kavanagh's on-camera answer is the cleanest documented instance. A named, verifiable former SEAL placing British Special Forces at the top globally in a recorded interview with no apparent incentive to be generous. That's real, and it's a description of professional sentiment rather than institutional concession. The distinction matters, and it doesn't undermine the argument. Professional admiration from rivals is worth considerably more than self-promotion from the institution being praised. When a man who has done this work himself says it, he's not being diplomatic. He's giving the assessment his own experience built. The gate sign story, whether it happened at one base or a dozen over different decades, survives in circulation because it captures something true about the dynamic, even if the specific gate can't be confirmed. It's the compression of a real relationship into a joke that requires no explanation to the people inside those communities. There is a line that circulates widely, most often attributed to George Orwell. The exact wording, "People sleep peaceably in their beds at night only because rough men stand ready to do violence on their behalf," actually originates from a 1993 Washington Times column by journalist Richard Grenier, who paraphrased Orwell's thinking about civilization and violence without quotation marks. Orwell never wrote those precise words, but the idea is genuinely his, expressed across his essays on Kipling and on the nature of nationalism. That the comfort of modern civil life is underwritten by people doing a job that the comfortable would prefer not to examine too carefully. The country that benefits from that work tends to be the last to want to hear about it from the people doing it. On January 15, 2019, at 14 Riverside Drive in Westlands, Nairobi, that thought wasn't abstract. It was a man in a balaclava and civilian jeans, carrying wounded people out of a building with his arms, going back through the door, doing it again. The argument about which Special Forces unit on Earth is the best tends to resolve itself, not cleanly, not officially, but consistently, whenever someone uses Nairobi as the evidence. Not because Britain has been making the case. Britain's official response was to suppress it, block the book, describe the man as an institutional liability, deliver his second highest gallantry award through a civil servant in a side office, and pursue him through the court system when he tried to tell the story himself. Britain's establishment has worked with some persistence to ensure that as little of this story as possible gets told within its own borders. The Americans keep telling it anyway. The veteran communities online, the podcasts, the channels where former operators discuss these questions with the specific authority of people who've done the work. They keep reaching for the same event. Not because the SAS is flawless or because the SEALs and Delta are inferior in every dimension, but because on a specific afternoon in January 2019, the gap between training and reality closed entirely in one man's decision to get in a car and drive toward the smoke. Around 700 people walked out of that complex alive across 19 hours. 22 didn't make it. All 5 attackers were killed. Somewhere in Nairobi, a cafe cleaner named Enoch Kibet crawled through a basement gate and couldn't believe he was still breathing. Somewhere else in the city, Ronald Ngeno found out that the goodbye messages he'd sent to his family weren't, in fact, goodbye. A man climbed out of a refrigerator. Maylie Chapin eventually walked out through an exit. The closing image the debate always returns to isn't a scoreboard, not a slogan on a gate, not a training program comparison or a funding argument. It's one man cutting through Nairobi's afternoon traffic toward gunfire that everyone else, everyone without 28 years of the hardest military training Britain produces, was instinctively backing away from. The debate keeps ending the same way, because somebody has to actually walk through the door. You can argue selection processes and funding and equipment and deployment tempo forever, and none of it means anything until someone has to make that decision, alone, on a Tuesday afternoon, with no orders and no team and no guarantee of anything except that there are people inside who haven't made it out yet. On that Tuesday, he did. Who dares wins. Demonstrated, not recited. Subscribe for more stories like this.